My name is Daniel Forster. I'm an MBA student at Southern Cross University. This is Assessment 3 for Industry Project, Research Project A. Titled my assessment for Research Project B is going to be correlation between education and earnings. Slightly shorter than I'd intended when I had done my first presentation and my second assessment for the A part of this project. I want to research the correlation between completed years of education and hourly or early yearly earnings. I've chosen this off-the-shelf project due to my own curiosity over the years. It did pique my interest once I noticed this one was available a couple of months back. I think it's great that the diversity of the people I work with and the secondary data set that I have access to at work really dovetails well with this subject, and I want to use that as a complement to the secondary data set that is available from SCU on the subject, which I will utilise. Introduction. So the business/social question I want to solve is the number of years of education a key driver of earning potential for any individual? And the secondary question is, are there other key influences on earnings potential, such as experience or types of education? There are many more points I could discuss here. I really want to explore those possible findings in my paper. I'm interested to see if these influences coexist as well, and whether or not they are mutually exclusive. So, further introduction, why I chose the subject. I have always been intrigued by the correlation between education, especially tertiary education, and a person's ability to firstly obtain a role, but secondly their potential, I guess, to be remunerated with a higher wage as someone with less education. My personal story is that I have a trade background. I'm an electrician. I was a small business owner for 9 years. I then went to the mining industry. I was promoted through the ranks there, where I spent my night times studying an advanced diploma level electrical engineering certificate. I've made my way throughout my career to now I'm a project manager in a large tier 1 business in the utilities sector, and I now manage my peers with, these people have master's degrees and bachelor's degrees, and many years of education and many different backgrounds, and I suppose my curiosity was piqued by the fact that I'm earning more, or at least as much, as most of these people who seem to have many years of education more than myself. I finished school in year 10, but at the same time, the irony is that a lot of them are quite young, and that's probably the journey that I want to take on my research paper for Project B. Is where does the sliding scale start and end? By the time these people are my age, will they be earning a lot more than me? And is that because of the education factor, or is it something more to do with experience, or a mix of both? So what have I learned so far in Industry Research Project A? I've learned there's an abundance of literature on this question. It's principally based on the institutional context of human capital theory. Many influences on an individual's earnings from my research so far in this project. Also many influences on an individual's journey before and throughout their education, which can affect the correlation between education and earnings. Some of the externalities that I sort of touched on in my first paper was just, as I say, externalities such as luck, genetics. I think scholarships due to sporting prowess, debating prowess, it could be artistic prowess. I think these things do have a lot to do with an education journey and an individual's ability to turn that education or type of education into So points I plan to discuss: I plan to critically analyse literature and empirical data on the following: human capital theory, expenditure on education, genetic endowment, vocational training such as apprenticeships and internships, which I think is a branch of this subject that hasn't been reviewed as sort of as deeply as it possibly could. Also, signalling theory. I aim to research the influence of different education journeys also, such as expensive private education or standard public education on future earnings. I'm intrigued as to what can become of an individual with rich parents or a rich family, or if they come from an expensive suburb or town. Could just be geography. Suburbs and municipalities and towns, some of these, even countries, have much better education systems than others. And I don't want to do too deep a dive into those externalities, but I believe that the literature and the data is available to review and discuss. And obviously I believe I can expand on that. New angles that I plan to add to the discussion. I guess what I've just previously mentioned there on the previous slide, discussions around geography and parental background and wealth. I also plan to use data from my own workplace, and I want to compare the results through simple linear analysis to the worldwide average data provided in the unit. I want to critically analyse the comparison between the two, taking into account current market influences of my peers and the data I will be grabbing from my workplace, the diversity of my workplace, which I think is an important factor. Also, the effect of the standard of education used in that data. When I interview my colleagues, I will be asking that question about where they were educated, whether it was private or public. Obviously, I'm interested in the comparison between the average data of sort of worldwide figures that's available from SCU and also my own empirical study. I plan to discuss countries in which my colleagues were educated, as it is a very diverse group of people I work with, and also whether they were privately or publicly educated, as mentioned. And I think that does feed into the quality of education discussion that I will discuss further. So previous studies, obviously human capital theory is something I really read through and reviewed in my first assessment for industry research projectA. So works by Schultz, which was very early literature and research into human capital theory. MINSA, literature and research on the effect of what I mentioned earlier there, would do the expenditure on an individual's education, and Becker, literature on questions raised by that human capital concept. And I think there'll be a lot of discussion throughout my paper around the quote. Probably the most impressive piece of evidence is that more highly educated and skilled persons almost always tend to earn more than others. Becker, 1964. So for the previous studies, signalling theory, I plan to review literature by Spence, what he calls the reduction of asymmetry between two parties and the costly signal of rigorous higher education. Also, Berg, signalling theory, separating equilibrium is a phrase that he uses. And Galbraith, who discusses utilising a higher education degree to distinguish between or separate high from low quality actors. Galbraith, 1973, a very personal story about the hiring of a person with a very serious amount of education who ultimately failed in their role due to the fact that they just could not go back to the nuts and bolts of what they were doing. I feel that the signal was very strong through the interview process that this person was overqualified, and it is a lesson that I learned that it's not necessarily the same as experience, or it does not necessarily relate to one's ability to perform a certain role. Also, want to discuss externalities from previous literature by Mincer on the genetic endowment and parental wealth angle that I mentioned previously. EAD, measurement of school quality, which I've also discussed, and also just review the effect of scholarships due to sporting prowess or artistic or academic prowess or debating prowess on earnings. I think that's something new that I can add to the literature. I feel that, as previously mentioned, there is more to earnings than just education. There is what education, what leg up did a person through society have? What advantages did individuals have over others when they went through that educational journey? Unfortunately, I feel that there are more questions than answers after industry research projectA, but that is a good thing, and I'm looking forward to taking a deep dive into the subject. So my contribution to the literature, I want to analyse external effects on my colleagues' earnings, such as experience brought from a similar field or the individual's innate abilities to fit into a culture, the culture that we work in now. Also the influence of genetics on manual labourers' careers. By that I mean perhaps my own journey. A stronger man may stay in a manual labouring job for a very long time and make his way to a superintendent or construction managerial type role. Others may flounder and without higher education may just remain at a lower level within their careers. I think that I can discuss that with a lot of the people that I have access to in my workplace. I also want to analyse the effects of networks and obviously the markets that people operate in throughout a career. I believe that sometimes it's not what you know, sometimes it's who you know, and I think that there is some definite value in taking a bit of a deep dive into those ideas. Obviously compare the data from this controlled environment against the data set from SCU, and I think that will be an interesting angle. Proposed data and empirical strategy. So an overview of the proposed data source. I'm proposing to use secondary data sourced from SCU in my unit content. This data contains worldwide average years of education and corresponding average hourly earnings, which I will complement by a further secondary data set from my workplace. So from where am I getting this further data set? It's intellectual property from my employer. The secondary data on hourly earnings is available to me as a project manager and estimator, and it is approved for my use by my employer. It'll be supplemented by interviews which I'll conduct with my colleagues, where I will obtain the years of education that these people have completed, and also I intend to obtain information on whether they were privately or publicly educated and where they were educated, which is going to be a very interesting set of interviews as it's quite a diverse workplace. So proposed data and empirical strategy. Further on, the empirical approach, simple linear regression, which I'll utilise to estimate the relationship between the independent variable of years of education and the dependent variable of hourly earnings. Both of these variables are quantitative. Very basic example of a scatter plot below. I intend to be taking the next week or so going back over some linear regression that I studied previously in my MBA journey. So I suppose collecting the primary data, sifting through it to make sure that the validity of everything I have is up to scratch, and putting forward the results onto the page and then discussing. So in closing, I am interested in the comparison between the linear regression and the discussion on the average worldwide data that was sourced from Southern Cross University and my own empirical study, where I feel that I can discuss and review and analyse some different angles and some different externalities, such as where the diverse group of people were educated and how much private and public education was involved in their years of education. This completes my PowerPoint presentation for assessment number 3. Thank you.